Hi guys, Dr. Stephen Samuel here. So I've become really interested in why people adhere really closely to certain fantasy stereotypes and tropes. So dwarves have beards, elves have pointy ears, beholders have to be evil, this sort of stuff. So the thing I wanted to learn about first was how deeply people felt about these stereotypes, how strongly they adhered to them. Specifically, would people play a game which reversed or changed these particular stereotypes and tropes? So would you play a game where dwarves had no beards, for example? And by game I mean TTRPG. So I asked a bunch of people online how likely they would be to play a TTRPG with the following characteristics, and 275 people responded. So would you play a TTRPG with an elf with pointed ears? Standard. Would you play a TTRPG with an elf with rounded ears? Did the same for beardless dwarves, did the same for orange orcs instead of green, which is not exactly the stereotype, but it's close enough to the stereotype. Of course, Tolkien's orcs were brown-ish, but your Hero Quest orcs were green, and maybe the stereotype is more green, but you could argue about that. The other ones were, would you play a game with a beholder which had legs versus a beholder that floats? I love that one. There were also questions about morality, so would you play a game where dwarves were typically evil, or elves were typically evil, beholders were typically good, orcs were typically good, and people could respond using a slider. So they would just say how likely, in terms of a percentage, they would be to play a game with these characteristics. Now, some of the 275 respondents said 0 for all types, so they wouldn't play a TTRPG with elves with pointed ears or round ears, presumably because they don't want to play a game with elves, and that's not their bag. So those people were removed because they simply wouldn't play anything, and tropes and stereotypes mean nothing to them. They already don't like them. It's not to say that their opinion is discarded. It's just in terms of being able to compare how popular the trope is with the subversion of the trope, we can't have 0 values in there. So I'm going to tell you the results, but I'm also going to tell you potentially the reason why people feel the way they do, and that's the thing that I found really interesting. The strongest feelings tended to be around matters of appearance rather than matters of morality. What do I mean by that? For pointy-eared elves, 80% of people would play a TTRPG where elves had pointy ears. If the elves had round ears, that dropped to 44%. So fewer than half of respondents would play a TTRPG where elves had round ears. Precisely the same percentage of people who would play a TTRPG with pointy-eared elves would play a TTRPG with bearded dwarves, so 80% both times. And again, people didn't like the idea of a non-canonical dwarf, so if you had a beardless dwarf, it dropped below 50%. It was 47% to be specific. When it came to beholders, that's it. So 82% of people would play a TTRPG with a beholder without legs, one that floated. If you added legs to beholder, now we drop to 39%. People really don't want to play a game with a legged beholder. And with orcs, the difference was a bit less drastic. So you had 74% of people who said they would play a TTRPG with green orcs, but 56% of people who said they would play a TTRPG with orange orcs. So not a drastic difference, and still over half who would play with orange orcs. Now, when it came to morality, things were a bit less clear. So for example, with elves, people didn't actually care whether elves were good or evil aligned. From some of the comments, I also found that many people don't care about elves. Controversial. So for good elves, 64% of people would play, but with evil elves, 62%. So hardly any difference there. And statistically speaking, there's no reliable difference between those two. For evil orcs, it was 66%. For good orcs, it was 60%. Obviously, modern D&D, there's less of a difference perhaps now, but that again is a small difference, but it is statistically speaking reliable, so it is different. For good dwarves it was 68%, but for evil dwarves it was 58%. Again, a reliable difference there. So people don't particularly want to play with evil dwarves, but they would, at least more than half. So evil beholders was at 77% and good beholders at 52%. So again, teeny bit over half, and a reliable difference between the two. So in sum, in every case, people always preferred the canonical, traditional, stereotypical trope version of the fantasy creature, whether in terms of appearance or morality, with the sole exception of elf morality. So now we know that yes, people do hold these stereotypes relatively dear because they would be less likely to play in games which deviated from them. Now the question is, why? So in the same study, I also asked people how frequently they wanted combat to occur in their TTRPG experiences. And that was also done on a slider, from never, very rarely, to always, very often, that sort of thing. And what I did was I correlated the results of the combat preference with how people felt about these stereotypes and tropes. And my hypothesis here was that the more someone cared about combat, the more likely they were to care about this stereotypical canonical version of the fantasy creature. Why? Because one of the benefits of gaming in fantasy is you have neat, clear distinctions between good and evil, creatures that you can attack without having to think about it, and creatures that you can't attack without having to think about it. Orcs, beholders, dragons, various creatures where if you have the power to do so, so you're not being idiotic by charging into battle with them, you know that if you are a good aligned character, you can get away with doing that. Your god isn't going to give you trouble, you're not going to have sleepless nights, because they are evil by design. So what the results showed was that the more frequently a participant wanted combat, the higher a probability they would give to playing a game where the creatures were exactly as you would expect them to be. When it came to the alternative forms like the orange orcs or your evil aligned dwarves, combat made no difference. A preference for combat did not relate to those. It only related to the canonical versions. So there seems to be a connection, a correlational connection, between a desire for more combat and desire for things to stay as they are in fantasy. Now we have to be careful in how far we draw this conclusion, because this is correlational data. So for example, one of the things that this could be tapping is that people who like D&D, which is quite a combat heavy game, just want D&D to stay the same. So it's not necessarily a love of combat that drives people to keep fantasy stereotypes the same. It might be a love of D&D that drives people to want D&D to stay the same. There can be a sort of fantasy conservatism, and one of the things that might drive this fantasy conservatism is the desire to keep combat a good part and a powerful part and a meaningful part of the TTRPG experience. Because once you have to start thinking about whether you should attack a creature, because it might be morally dubious to do so, then you might not be able to enjoy the combat element so much. So what does this seem to tell us overall? In sum, people do generally prefer the canonical, stereotypical, traditional format, but that a strong preference for combat, or the stronger the preference for combat, the greater the preference for things to stay the same. And that could be because people want to be able to have combat freely and easily without any sort of moral ambiguity getting in the way of them doing that. So yes, you can fire that bow, you can attack first, you can go for the surprise attack. So another caveat here, of course, is that when you're working with stereotypes, you tend to work with the most common game, and the most common game, and the most popular game, and the biggest game when it comes to TTRPGs is D&D. This is where most of the stereotypes are at. Of course, this could also be done with science fiction games, it could be done with horror games, it could be done with modern games. But you will notice as well that the more games move away from the fantastic, the less likely there is to be combat in them, or the less important combat is to that experience. If you take a game like Bubblegum Shoe, a more recent game which is full of social takedowns and is basically American teenagers solving crimes, there's basically no combat in there at all. Why? Because it's too close to home. It's too much like everyday life, and we wouldn't normally want to go around killing people in everyday life. So fantasy allows us to just go flip and think about it later, and people don't want to change that if they like combat. So it seems. Thank you very much for your attention. Hope you enjoyed that, and see you soon.